The soft chime above the boutique door rang as Eileen Walker stepped inside, letting a breath of cold February air follow her into the warm, fragrant space. Outside, snow fell in lazy spirals across the quiet Chicago street, muffling the city's usual rhythm, but in here, everything gleamed. The lighting was soft and flattering, casting a golden glow on the walls lined with glass cases and delicate gowns in shades of ivory, blush, and moonlight. A soft classical piece floated from hidden speakers, barely audible under the muted rustle of silk and organza. The scent of white lilies mixed with the faint aroma of polished wood. Every detail was curated to make women feel like princesses. Every detail, except Eileen. She paused just past the threshold, taking a moment to absorb the room. Her long coat, worn at the cuffs, was still speckled with snowflakes. A loosely wrapped scarf, once pale pink, had dulled with time and wear. Her boots were practical, not elegant. Her hair was swept into a low, tidy knot, no makeup touched her face, and her cheeks glowed not from blush but from the sting of winter wind. She looked like someone who didn't belong there. And almost immediately she was made to feel so. From behind the counter, two boutique assistants glanced up from their tablets. The taller one, with sleek blonde hair and a fitted navy dress, tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as they assessed Eileen's appearance. She didn't speak, but the faint twitch of her mouth said enough. The other, younger, with clipped red nails and an immaculately pressed white blouse, leaned forward with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone just polite enough to avoid accusation, just cold enough to establish rank. Eileen gave a small, hesitant smile and stepped forward, the soft thud of her boots on the plush carpet sounding oddly loud in the hush. "I was hoping to try on a gown," she said, her voice low, steady, careful. There was a pause, just a beat too long. The blonde assistant straightened her back and folded her arms lightly. "We usually work by appointment," she said, tilting her head to one side. "But if you'd like to leave your information, we can see what's available next week." Eileen's eyes drifted toward one of the mannequins by the window. The dress on it was simple but perfect, long lace sleeves, an open back, a high neckline with embroidered detail that reminded her of wildflowers. Her gaze lingered, as if the dress were an old friend waiting patiently for her return. She turned back to the women. "I won't be long," she said softly. "I just wanted to see how it feels." Another pause. A longer one this time. The younger woman exchanged a glance with her colleague, then stepped out from behind the counter. "Well," she said with forced brightness, "this isn't a self-service store. Let me see if we have something appropriate." She led Eileen toward the racks with the air of someone indulging a harmless stranger, not quite unkind, but not warm either. As Eileen followed, the woman stopped abruptly. Actually, she said, reaching for a less popular dress at the far end of the room. "Why don't we try this one first? It's off-season, but sweet." Her voice almost caught on the last word. Eileen took the gown carefully, almost reverently, her fingers brushing the fabric like it was sacred. She nodded, not speaking, and headed toward the changing rooms, though she knew exactly where they were. She'd never been in this boutique before, not in this life, not in this body with this name, but something about the place felt achingly familiar, but like an old melody she couldn't quite place. At the corner, an older woman sitting near the waiting chairs glanced up from her phone. She watched Eileen with a curious, thoughtful look. Unlike the others, her eyes didn't skim the coat or the boots or the undone nails. Instead, they lingered on the softness of her expression, the way she held the dress, the stillness in her shoulders. She said nothing, but her gaze followed Eileen until she disappeared behind the curtain. In the dressing room, the lights were warm and generous, the mirror tall and forgiving. Eileen took off her coat slowly, folding it over her arm before hanging it on the hook. Beneath, she wore a simple navy dress with a high neckline and sleeves that had seen better days. She looked at herself, studied her reflection, the fine lines near her mouth, the slight hollowness beneath her eyes. She wasn't old, but she had lived through years that had aged her quietly. With a deep breath, she stepped into the gown, her hands instinctively guiding the fabric, fingers working the zipper, as if they'd done it 1,000 times before. The lace hugged her arms like a whisper. The bodice settled against her ribs with a breathless kind of precision. As she turned slightly toward the mirror, a hush fell over her thoughts. She looked taller. Not because of the gown, but because of something deeper, like the dress had reached into her and reminded her of a version of herself that had long been asleep. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stood there for a long moment, breathing, not moving, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the embroidered neckline. From the hallway, faint laughter floated in. Someone said something about delivery delays. Another voice asked about champagne. In that moment, in that small dressing room, Eileen became invisible to the world again, but visible to herself for the first time in years. The sound of the curtain sliding back was so soft it was almost lost in the gentle hum of the boutique, but for Eileen it felt deafening. She stepped out slowly, not seeking attention, yet the subtle rustle of lace and fabric as she moved drew eyes like a magnet. The dress transformed her not in the way people usually meant, not as a disguise or a fantasy, but as a quiet return to a version of herself she hadn't dared to acknowledge in years. Her hair, still loosely pinned, had begun to fall in soft waves around her cheeks. Her eyes, unpainted, looked clearer in the golden light. She didn't try to pose or play a role. She simply stood, letting herself be. The older woman in the waiting chairs straightened a little, watching her with a softened gaze. But it was the reaction from the boutique staff that landed like a chill in the otherwise warm air. Claire, the blonde assistant who had been skeptical from the start, clicked her pen sharply and turned to glance over her shoulder. Her eyes swept Eileen from head to toe in a way that wasn't curiosity, but assessment. She looked at the dress, one of the boutique's more exclusive designs, intricate and costly, and then at Eileen's worn boots peeking out from beneath the hem, the undone fingernails. The old scarf still folded on the nearby chair. Her lips pressed into a thin smile that didn't pretend to be kind. "That piece is part of our designer collection," she said, loud enough for the few other women in the store to hear. "It's not usually taken off the mannequin without a deposit." The silence that followed was subtle but deep. The younger clerk, Megan, hovered nearby, shifting from foot to foot, uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict her colleague. Eileen turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Claire's. She didn't speak, not at first. The moment hung in the air, delicate as the lace on her sleeve. "I was told it was all right to try it," she said quietly. Her voice held no tremor, but it didn't challenge either. It was a simple truth, delivered with the kind of steadiness that either disarms or enrages. Claire stepped forward a bit, adjusting the sleeve of her fitted dress as if to reassert control. "It is," she replied, smile returning, cool and sharp. "Though we do usually prioritize clients who book fittings in advance, our designer pieces are, well, they're not for everyone." That last phrase hung in the air like the final note of a wrong chord. It wasn't an accusation. It was worse. It was dismissal dressed as etiquette, exclusion disguised as policy. Another woman, standing near the mirror with her mother and bridesmaids, looked over at Eileen with a smirk. She was young, confident, wearing heels that clicked when she shifted her weight, and her makeup was perfect in that curated social media way. She leaned slightly toward her group and whispered something behind her hand. Her mother stifled a laugh. Eileen heard it. Of course she did. Everyone did. But she didn't respond. She simply turned back to the mirror, her fingertips brushing the waist of the gown, the lace there softer than memory. And her expression didn't change. She stood a little taller. And that, more than anything, seemed to irritate Claire. Megan, perhaps sensing the shift, stepped forward with a clip of a smile. "Would you like to see it with a veil?" she offered, trying to balance the room's tension. "We have one from the same collection." Claire shot her a look, quick and slicing, but said nothing. Eileen glanced between them, then nodded once. Yes. Thank you. As Megan hurried off, another client approached the counter, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his 40s with a fiancée at his side. They'd been browsing silently until now. He tapped the glass gently with his knuckle, and Claire, in her element, turned with an exaggerated warmth. Eileen faded into the background as quickly as she had risen in attention. While the veil was retrieved, Eileen moved back to the mirror. She didn't study herself with vanity or doubt. Her hands moved slowly along the folds of the gown, then came to rest near the embroidery on the sleeve. A faint smile touched her lips, wistful, almost private. It was as if the dress wasn't just fabric, but language, and she was remembering how to read it again. Noticing something, she leaned in, her brow furrowing slightly. The hem, hidden under a fold, bore a tiny variation in stitch intentional. She touched it gently, then whispered under her breath, still doing that little X on the corners. Just like you taught me. The words weren't meant to be heard. But Megan, returning with the veil, paused, uncertain. She looked at Eileen, really looked now. There was something unfamiliar in her face, not just in appearance, but in presence. Megan glanced down at the veil in her hands and approached more quietly than before. She offered it without speaking, and Eileen took it with a nod. As she placed it lightly over her hair, something about her seemed to crystallize, not just a bride-to-be, but something older than that. Something sacred. Claire, meanwhile, turned back to watch. Her jaw was set now, her eyes narrowed. She walked forward again, her heels silent on the carpet, stopping just behind Megan. You know, she said with false sweetness, we do have other dresses that might be more accessible. Not everyone finds themselves at ease in couture. Sometimes a simpler piece feels more natural. The older woman by the chairs stirred. This one suits her just fine, she said suddenly. Her voice was calm, measured, and cut clean through the boutique's atmosphere. It's the only one that's felt real in here all day. Claire blinked, caught off guard. Megan looked away. Eileen turned, her eyes finding the older woman's. For the first time that day, Eileen smiled, not politely, not carefully, but fully. She took a step closer to the mirror, adjusting the veil, and in her reflection, something shifted. She didn't look like a customer anymore. She looked like someone who belonged. But the air didn't stay still for long. Another voice, this time a more managerial tone, cut through the room. "Excuse me," said a woman emerging from the back office, clipboard in hand. "I was reviewing security and saw we had an unscheduled fitting with one of the restricted pieces. Can someone explain?" It was Ellen Moore, the store manager. Her tone was not aggressive, but it carried authority. She stopped mid-step when she saw Eileen, the dress, the veil. Claire answered first. She just walked in. No appointment. Megan let her try it. "I assumed it was fine, but I thought we had a policy for pieces over 7,000. Ellen said nothing at first. She walked slowly forward, eyes not on Claire, not on Megan, but on Eileen. Something passed through her expression. Not recognition, not quite, but something adjacent to it. She stopped a few feet away. Eileen turned to face her. Neither woman blinked. In the mirror behind them, they looked like mirror images of control, one guarded, one calm. "I was just trying it on," Eileen said quietly. "It won't take long." The room held its breath. Ellen nodded once, but her voice was flat. "Fine. Just be careful with the detailing. That piece took over 100 hours of handwork." "I know," Eileen said softly. "I remember." That reply did something. Ellen's face twitched just slightly. A pause opened in her mind, a flicker of confusion or something deeper. But she said nothing. She turned and walked away. The moment passed. But the seed of something else had been planted, and no one in the boutique, except Eileen, understood just how much it was about to grow. Megan stayed nearby as Eileen returned to the mirror, adjusting the veil with steady hands that seemed to know every fold, every curve of the fabric. There was a quiet precision in her movements, not the hesitant fussing of a woman overwhelmed by couture, but the calm of someone who'd handled such things before. She turned slowly, observing how the fabric moved around her, how the light caught on the embroidery near her collarbone. For a moment, everything else in the boutique faded: the rustle of bags, the muted conversations, even the background music. Eileen wasn't performing. She wasn't pretending. She was remembering. Becoming. But not everyone could stand still in the presence of something authentic. Claire returned, this time holding a small clipboard with customer notes, tapping it rhythmically against her manicured fingers. Her smile was sharper now, less of a social mask and more of a challenge. She stepped in front of Megan and addressed Eileen directly, but her tone was honeyed with that brittle politeness that always cut deeper than open hostility. "Miss, I didn't catch your last name," she began, tilting her head. Eileen looked at her through the veil, her voice level. "Walker." "Miss Walker," Claire echoed with an appreciative nod. "We usually ask clients to leave some form of deposit, or, at the very least, contact information before trying on the attire line. I'm sure Megan didn't mean to bypass procedure, but this dress is from our private archive, and well." She gave a soft, faux apologetic laugh. "We've had misunderstandings before. You understand, I'm sure." There was something in her smile that waited for Eileen to flinch, to step back, to apologize and quietly hand the dress over. But Eileen didn't. She looked at Claire and, with the same quiet voice she'd used since she entered the store, simply said, "I do understand." She turned back toward the mirror, as if the conversation were complete, her reflection once again holding her attention more than anyone else in the room. But Claire wasn't ready to be dismissed. Not by someone she still couldn't place. Not by someone whose boots still tracked salt water into her pristine domain. She took a step closer, dropping the clipboard onto a nearby table with a loud enough thud to draw attention. "You said earlier that you remembered something about this dress," she pressed. "Have you worn this design before? It hasn't been in circulation for years. I doubt it would be familiar to anyone outside the atelier." Eileen didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. The pause was deliberate, filled with air thick enough to make Claire shift uncomfortably. Megan moved slightly to the side, her hands folded in front of her now, uncertain. The older woman by the window still watched, one hand resting on her purse, her gaze unwavering. "I remember the embroidery," Eileen said finally, her eyes still on the mirror. "It was designed for a winter collection that never launched. The original draft had a floral collar, but it didn't sit well with the shoulder structure. The correction was subtle, a tapering leaf pattern instead. Less obvious, more intentional." Claire blinked. The way Eileen spoke, the terminology, the certainty it didn't align with her assumptions. For a flicker of a second, something inside her recalibrated, then rejected what it saw. She laughed lightly again, as if trying to dismiss the mounting discomfort. "That's a very specific observation." "I know," Eileen replied, still not looking at her. "Because I made it." And just like that, the room tilted slightly off-center. Claire's laughter stopped, a little too abruptly. Megan's eyes widened, barely concealing her shock. The bride from earlier turned slightly, her friends pausing mid-conversation to glance toward the dressing area again. Even Ellen, from behind the counter where she'd been reviewing stock orders, looked up sharply, her hand freezing mid-scroll across a digital tablet. Claire recovered first, lifting a skeptical brow. "I'm sorry you designed this dress?" Eileen finally turned to face her, the veil cascading gently as she moved. "Not just this one. I co-developed the winter line 6 years ago, under the name Eleanor W. Attire. The name was dropped after the redesign, but the stitches remained the same. The name hit like a quiet ripple in the still water of the boutique. Eleanor W. It was a whisper in the fashion world known only among design circles, mentioned in articles about craftsmanship and heritage design. No public appearances, no interviews, and a name with a myth, but no face, a ghost behind the gowns. Claire tried to laugh again, but it came out thin. That's not possible. Eleanor W. is, well, that's a pen name. We've heard it's a retired European tailor or a design collective no one really knows. There's no public record. Eileen didn't blink. That's the point. Another pause. Heavier now. Ellen stood from behind the counter and came around slowly, her expression measured, uncertain. She stopped just behind Claire. Are you saying, Ellen asked cautiously, that you are Eleanor W.? Eileen looked at her. That I was. Before the name stopped being mine. Ellen's face shifted in that moment, not in shock, but in memory. A memory surfacing through time like something long buried. She took another step forward, her eyes narrowing, focused now not just on what Eileen said, but how she stood, how her hands moved, how her gaze never faltered. Eileen Walker, Ellen said slowly, testing the name. You were here once before. You came with Marie. The name settled into the room like dust after a storm. Marie. A name that meant nothing to most, but everything to Eileen and Ellen. She brought me when she bought the space, Eileen said quietly. Back when it was still a fabric warehouse with broken windows and no heat. I thought you left, Ellen murmured. I did, Eileen replied. I never planned to come back. Megan looked from one woman to the other, understanding dawning like morning light. Claire stood frozen, her face carefully blank now, unsure where the ground beneath her had gone. She reached for her clipboard again, but didn't know what to write. And in that strange, suspended moment, the veil slipped gently off Eileen's hair and floated down her back like a sigh. I just wanted to try it on, she said softly, almost to herself now. Just once. No one moved. No one dared. Then from the corner, the older woman who had been watching all along slowly rose. She walked to Eileen and placed one hand lightly on her shoulder, her voice low and full of something between reverence and recognition. Whatever name you use, she said, this dress was always waiting for you. And with that, the spell was cast, not of spectacle, not of wealth, not of celebrity, but of truth, a quiet, undeniable truth that reshaped every assumption in the room. Eileen hadn't needed to raise her voice, hadn't needed to flaunt status or credentials. She'd simply stood in what she'd built, and let the dress speak for itself. Eileen stood still, the weight of the silence around her deeper now, not oppressive, but dense with something unspoken recognition, confusion, even reverence. The boutique no longer breathed in its usual rhythm of clinking hangers and softly exchanged judgments. Instead, it hovered around her, as if waiting for her to make the next move. But she didn't. She didn't need to. She had said what she came to say, not with declarations, but with the gentleness of truth. And now that the air had cleared, the veil quite literally lifted, something fragile but firm settled over the room. Ellen remained a step away, eyes still on Eileen, but her expression had changed. It no longer held the suspicion of a manager protecting her business or the caution of someone trying to gauge the credibility of a bold claim. It was something far older than that, far more human. Memory, perhaps. Or guilt. I didn't think I'd see you again, she said finally, her voice softer than before, the edge worn off. When Marie passed, we thought you'd vanished. I did, Eileen replied, without emotion, just stating fact. I couldn't stay. Everything here reminded me of her, but none of it felt like her. Not anymore. The lights got colder, and the staff more polished. Even the lace changed. Her voice wasn't bitter, only tired. The kind of tired that comes from years of holding silence in the body, like carrying a folded letter that's never been read aloud. Ellen let out a breath, and though it wasn't quite an apology, it wasn't a defense either. Businesses change. They have to, if they're going to survive. Eileen nodded, slowly, as if she didn't disagree, but also didn't accept that as enough. I know. But survival wasn't why we started this. She didn't dream of numbers. And that name she hung in the air between them again. Marie. The sister. The co-founder, the dreamer. The one who had loved design with the kind of reckless joy that Eileen had only ever approached through structure and precision. Marie had been the warmth. Eileen, the bone. And together they had made something whole. And when Marie died, that wholeness broke in two. I thought I could grieve by forgetting, Eileen said, her voice quieter now, almost to herself. But some things don't dissolve with time. They just change shape. The dress she wore, her own design, was the last thing they'd worked on together, never released, shelved indefinitely after Marie's death. Eileen had seen it once on a mannequin in an obscure fashion blog photo and had turned her screen off mid-scroll, unable to look. She hadn't returned to the city in nearly 5 years. She'd taken her grief into the mountains, away from the boutiques, the showrooms, the runways, and for a while she thought it was enough. She lived simply, wrote by hand, watched seasons pass, thought about maybe teaching someday. But the dress kept whispering. That's why she came. Not to be recognized, not to reclaim ownership, not to make a point. She came to remember what it felt like to stand in something made not for the market, but for meaning. Ellen, as if sensing all this without needing the explanation, stepped back and looked toward Claire, who stood rigid, pale, but still holding her clipboard like a weapon she no longer knew how to use. Ellen's voice didn't rise, but it was firm when she spoke. Claire, why don't you take your lunch break? Claire's mouth opened slightly, as if to protest, but then closed. She nodded once and walked away, not toward the back, but out the front door, coatless and fast. Megan stepped forward slightly, eyes wide, still absorbing the gravity of everything she'd witnessed. She cleared her throat and then, with the awkwardness of youth and sincerity, asked, "Why didn't you ever tell anyone who you were?" Eileen smiled gently, as if the question were familiar. "Because I didn't want to be someone. I just wanted to create." The older woman from the chair, whose name no one even knew, spoke again, her voice soft but rooted. "Then why come back?" Eileen looked at her, and for the first time her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something like peace, because today would have been her wedding day. A hush swept through the room. Megan looked down. Ellen closed her eyes briefly. No one asked for details. No one needed to. Eileen turned back toward the mirror. She raised her hand and brushed it once more across the lacework at her shoulder, feeling the faintest bump of the stitch that only she and Marie had ever known how to do, a double knot cross hidden under the fold. It was their signature, invisible to everyone else, but never forgotten by either of them. She'd placed it there herself, the night before Marie died, as a joke. "So you never forget who stitched you in," she'd said. And Marie had laughed, bright and full of life, and promised she wouldn't. The mirror didn't show a bride. Not in the traditional sense. There was no ceremony waiting, no groom outside, no bouquet or guests. It showed a woman who had lost and loved, who had built and left, who had returned not to relive the past, but to acknowledge it. There was strength in her posture now, not rigid, but earned, not proud, but peaceful. As if the act of putting on the dress had settled something within her that no apology, no legacy, no public acknowledgement ever could. The boutique was quiet, not with awkwardness, but with respect. For once, no one was selling anything. No one was posing. It was just a room full of people standing around one woman who, for a moment, reminded them that beauty could still be sacred, not marketed. That a wedding dress could still be about love, even if the love was for a sister, a memory, or a life that might have been. She didn't need permission to wear the dress. She didn't need to pay for it. She had already paid more than enough. The veil rested now on the velvet chair, its gentle folds echoing the rhythm of silence that had settled over the boutique. Eileen remained by the mirror, her hand softly placed at her waist, feeling the subtle heartbeat of the fabric she had once stitched into being. The weight of her presence, so unassuming at first, now filled the room like the scent of something long forgotten, rediscovered in a drawer left closed for too many years. But even as the air thickened with meaning, it was not agreement or reconciliation that followed, it was resistance. Not everyone could accept what had just unfolded with grace, and some silences were less about awe than about waiting to regain control. The boutique door opened with the quiet hiss of the pneumatic hinge, and a gust of cold wind brushed in behind Claire, who returned without her coat. Her cheeks flushed more with pride than weather. She held a sleek black phone in her hand, gripping it tightly as if it were a compass or a blade. Her heels echoed with sharper intent now, her smile gone, replaced by the stiff mask of professionalism fraying at the corners. Ellen glanced at her from across the floor, but said nothing. Megan, sensing the shift, moved instinctively closer to Eileen, as though unsure why but knowing that something unseen had begun to tilt again. Claire didn't go to the counter. She went straight to the center of the room, stood near one of the mannequins, and adjusted its hem with deliberate precision. Then, without looking up, she spoke, not loudly, but in a voice trained to command attention even when soft. "I just got off the phone with Geneva Holdings," she said, still smoothing the hemline. "They're requesting confirmation of ownership on our archived designs before reissuing next season's vintage line. Apparently there's some confusion." The word hung engineered for tension, and it worked. Ellen slowly turned toward her, her brows pulling together, not in confusion but in disappointment. Megan looked between them, uncertain whether this was shop talk or a veiled attack. But Eileen, unsurprised, remained still. "I assume you mean confusion," Eileen said calmly, "about which designs can be licensed under the current brand." Claire looked up then, straightening. "That's right, because as it stands, all intellectual property from the entire winter line was signed over to the holding company at the time of Marie Walker's death. Which means unless there's a written contract stating otherwise, those dresses are corporate assets." There it was. The rebuttal. The reassertion of control through paperwork, clause, and legal distance. She'd been rattled before, thrown off by the weight of Eileen's presence, by the truth woven into her words. But now she had armor, and she wore it well. Eileen didn't respond immediately. She turned back to the mirror and adjusted the sleeve of the dress, careful, unhurried. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't change. It was still soft, still certain. "I never claimed to own the dress," she said, "only that I made it." Claire stepped closer, her heels now loud again. "But that's not how ownership works, is it? You don't get to walk in and claim credit after 5 years of silence, especially when this boutique kept those designs alive, displayed them, protected them. That's what legacy looks like. Not a sudden reappearance in worn boots and nostalgia. It was an attack, finally spoken aloud, freed from the cage of passive aggression. The boutique grew still again. A young couple who had just entered hesitated near the door and then stepped back outside. Ellen closed her eyes slowly, pressing 2 fingers to her temple, but said nothing. Megan, eyes wide, looked to Eileen, as if searching for instruction on how to stand. Eileen turned from the mirror at last and faced Claire fully, her expression unreadable but not fragile. "You're right," she said. "I don't own this boutique. I don't have a title or a share or a name on the door. I never asked for one. I never wanted one. Marie knew that." Claire opened her mouth, but Eileen held up a hand not rudely, but with the kind of gravity that paused movement. "But you're wrong about legacy," she continued. "Legacy isn't what's printed in catalogs or sewn into tags. It's not what's filed in office drawers under archive. Legacy is what breathes when no one's watching. It's what's passed from one woman's hands to another's without needing explanation. You've sold the dresses. Yes, but you haven't kept them alive." Claire's jaw tightened, the blow landing harder than she would have expected. The words weren't angry. They weren't loud. But they stripped away the veneer she'd built for herself, the illusion of stewardship in the absence of understanding. And then, perhaps because her silence made the moment unbearable, she added, You don't have to be sentimental about it. We're running a business here. What matters is what sells. At that, Eileen's expression changed just slightly. Something behind her eyes darkened, not in anger, but in finality. I know what this place became, she said. And I'm not here to stop it. I just wanted to see if it remembered her, if any of you did. She stepped away from the mirror now, slowly walking past the mannequins, her fingers trailing along the edge of a table that held sample laces, the buttons arranged like museum pieces. Megan watched her like someone witnessing a procession. Ellen took a breath as if to speak, but stopped herself again. Marie believed. Eileen said, turning once more to face them all, that every woman deserved to feel beautiful not because someone sold it to her, but because something inside her recognized itself in the fabric. She believed a dress could hold memory. It could carry love. That it could be more than price tags and appointments. She paused, then smiled, tired but genuine. That's what I came here for. Not to make a claim. Not to challenge your hierarchy. Just to see if that thread was still somewhere in the weave. Her gaze passed over Megan, who swallowed hard, her throat tight. Then to Ellen, who stood quietly, hands folded in front of her, shame creeping just behind her composure. Finally, back to Claire, who no longer looked like the woman who had confidently tapped her pen against her clipboard. She looked like someone realizing she'd stepped into the middle of a story she'd never taken the time to read. But before anyone could respond, before the weight of what had just been said could settle fully, the front door opened again. This time, it wasn't a customer. It was a courier, out of breath and holding a large, flat envelope in one hand. He scanned the room and walked straight to Ellen. Delivery for E. Walker, he said, reading the name from the slip. Said it was urgent. Aches. Ellen blinked, startled. Here? The courier nodded, passed the envelope, and left as quickly as he'd come. Ellen turned toward Eileen and held it out silently. Eileen took it with a slight nod, opened the seal, and unfolded the contents within. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she looked up, her expression unreadable, and passed the paper back to Ellen. It's a release, she said, of design rights, retroactive. Marie filed it the week before she died. She never told me. Ellen stared at the paper, eyes scanning the handwritten signature at the bottom, the notary stamp, the date. Claire took a step forward. So you do own them? Eileen shook her head. No, she said. I never did. She just wanted to make sure I could walk back in if I ever wanted to. She looked around once more, then added, but I think I'll let the dresses stay here. Just not the silence. And with that, she turned away not as someone leaving defeated, but as someone finally finished with mourning. The boutique, once filled with a quiet buzz of curated civility and polite commerce, now stood in an unfamiliar stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm, but from recognition that something irreversibly truthful has been spoken, and no one present can quite return to the version of themselves that existed before hearing it. Eileen remained near the doorway now, the envelope still gently creased in her hand, her expression not triumphant but still. There was a clarity in her posture, a steady exhale that made her seem both lighter and more grounded than she had appeared all morning. The veil had long since slipped away, the gown now resting with ease against her, not as a borrowed costume, but as something familiar, something returned. Megan remained at her side, unmoving, the paper still visible in Ellen's trembling hands. As if some ancient lever had finally shifted, Ellen looked up, and what shone in her eyes was not shock or even apology, but something harder honesty. I didn't know she filed this, Ellen said quietly, her thumb tracing the edge of the signature as if it might vanish. I remember she came in early that week. Said she wanted to take care of old threads before stepping away for a while. I didn't ask questions. She always hated loose ends, Eileen said, and her voice had a faint thread of a laugh in it, a sound that trembled before fading. Even when it wasn't hers to tie. She knew you'd need a way back, Ellen added, and for a brief moment, the old roles returned the partners they had once been to Marie. The silent bond between women who had created something that outlived one of them and haunted the other. But Claire, standing to the side, wasn't ready to accept the shift. A shift that left her with no footing, no script, no name she could leverage. Her voice broke the stillness, flat but urgent. Even so, that doesn't change the structure. You've been absent. This business has evolved. We have schedules, fittings, appointments. This can't become personal. Eileen turned to her slowly, and in her gaze was not anger, but exhaustion of fighting, of proving, of being spoken over by people who measured value in visibility. She looked at Claire not as an adversary, but as a product of the very system that had turned beauty into transaction and memory into branding. It's always been personal, she said. That's the part you never understood. Every hemline, every seam, every decision about which fabric to use or where to place a stitch that was a conversation. Between the woman who wore the dress and the woman who made it. Between memory and skin. Claire opened her mouth again, but Ellen stepped forward before she could speak. Enough, she said, her voice firm, her eyes never leaving Eileen. We've spent the last 5 years polishing surfaces and forgetting the foundation. I've let it happen. I've chosen ease over essence. You don't have to stay, Eileen, but if you do, you'll decide what this place becomes. It landed differently. Even Claire felt it, even Megan. It was not a ceremonial offer, not an appeasement. It was a hand extended without condition, from one woman to another, not to reclaim ownership, but to restore soul. But Eileen didn't answer. She looked around the boutique, the racks of gowns, the clean glass cases, the soft lighting carefully adjusted to make reflections kinder. She saw the mannequin still draped in an unfinished piece, a design not hers but vaguely reminiscent, as if someone had tried to echo something without knowing the melody. Her eyes landed on a small side table where sample swatches were arranged like museum relics, beautiful but static, untouched. I don't think I can go back to what it was, she said finally, because it's not what it was, and neither am I. Megan's voice, small but steady, cut in for the first time. Then maybe it's time for something new. Eileen turned to her, surprised but not dismissive. Megan looked down at her hands, then back up, her cheeks pink but her voice holding. You could teach, she continued, glancing at the fabrics. You could show us what you meant. Not manage or approve or supervise, just show us. The idea hung in the air like a note played softly, left unresolved. Not a return, not a takeover, but a continuation. A new thread sewn through the fabric of what remained. For the first time, Eileen hesitated not because she doubted her ability, but because something within her shifted at the suggestion. The notion of creating again, not for memory but for future, not as a monument but as a path. She walked slowly toward the back corner of the boutique where an old dress form stood unused, a bit dusty. She laid a hand on it, fingers brushing across the worn linen cover, and turned slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. I would need a quiet room, she said. There's a sewing table. Natural light, if possible. Ellen exhaled, a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Done. Done. And no loud music, Eileen added. She hated being interrupted by sound she didn't choose. Of course, Megan said, a smile flickering at her lips, one of awe, like a child watching something sacred unfold. Claire stood silent now. The businesswoman in her wanted to interject, to speak about logistics and space planning and costs, but another part, the part not yet named, understood that a power had shifted, and not in her favor. Not because someone had taken her place, but because she'd never truly understood what that place had been for. She turned away without speaking again, and her silence was not resignation, it was realization. Eileen, still facing the dress form, touched a pin cushion resting nearby. Her fingers moved with instinct, picking a single pearl-headed pin and adjusting a fold that had sagged. It wasn't much, just a touch. But the fabric fell more cleanly, as if it had been waiting for that hand all along. And then she stepped back, quietly, eyes trailing upward toward the skylight above the corner table, where sunlight poured in through frosted glass, dust motes dancing like faint echoes in the light. The moment was neither grand nor dramatic. It was simple, honest. But something in the stillness declared that nothing in the boutique would be the same again. She didn't need applause. She didn't need an audience. She had the fabric. She had the light. She had the memory. And now finally she had the space. It had been 3 weeks since that quiet afternoon when Eileen had stepped into the boutique as a stranger and stood beneath the skylight as something else entirely, not a returned owner, not a forgotten name, but a presence that reawakened the room. Since then, the space had changed, though not in ways that could be captured by renovation or inventory. The racks still held satin and lace. The mirrors still reflected gentle light, and the air still smelled faintly of lilies and fabric starch, but beneath the familiar surfaces, something new had taken root, something that pulsed not with reinvention, but with remembrance made alive. At the far end of the boutique, the small room that had once stored unused display fixtures now stood open, reworked by hand, not by directive. A long wooden table sat beneath the wide window, where the afternoon sun pooled generously, flooding the pale floor with a glow more real than any overhead light could offer. Spools of thread lined the shelves in quiet rows, soft colors alongside deep, grounded tones, nothing garish, nothing trendy. A sewing machine, simple and precise, waited in the corner, not for show but for use. And near the table, pinned carefully on a worn dress form, a new design began to take shape, not a bridal gown, not a statement piece, but something gentle, a linen-wrapped dress with long sleeves and subtle pleats. Something you might wear to walk through a garden on a spring morning, or to say goodbye without words. Eileen sat at the table now, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, not hurried by deadlines or dictated by demand. She stitched quietly, the motion as natural to her as breathing. Each pass of the thread was a choice, not a task. And with each movement, the silence deepened, not an emptiness, but a fullness. From time to time, Megan would appear in the doorway, notebook in hand, asking questions not just about sewing, but about fabric grain, shoulder structure, weight, and fall. Eileen would answer without looking up, her voice low, even, and firm, and Megan would nod, write quickly, and return to her station, changed in a way she didn't yet have words for. Customers had begun to notice something, too. They couldn't always name it. They said the light felt warmer, that the staff seemed softer, that the dresses looked less like product and more like possibility. Brides lingered longer. Older women returned not with daughters, but with memories, pointing out stitches that reminded them of dresses their mothers once made by hand. Ellen, quieter now, often stood by the window, no longer overseeing as much as observing, her presence less commanding, more present. Even Claire, who still worked the floor with her curated grace and practiced posture, had changed in small ways. Her voice held less edge. Her glances no longer searched for status first. She watched Eileen from a distance, and though they rarely exchanged words, there was something in her expression now that resembled humility. Not defeat, but the beginning of understanding. No plaque had been hung. No announcement made. Eileen's presence remained informal, unmarketed. She came in when the sun was softest, worked when the room was quietest, left without fanfare. Her name was still absent from the boutique's brochures, and yet her influence was everywhere in the texture of new fabric orders, in the language the staff began to use when speaking to customers, in the way the mirrors were now angled not to elongate or flatter, but to embrace. On one such afternoon, the older woman who had watched Eileen that first day returned, her steps slow but steady, her eyes curious. She carried nothing but a photo in her hand, a small, creased image of herself at 22, standing in a homemade dress, smiling beneath a dogwood tree. She didn't say much, but Eileen welcomed her in, helped her sit, and listened. They didn't talk about price or timeline. They spoke about shape, color, memory, and feeling. And by the end of the hour, there was a sketch on the table and a shared silence that said more than any fitting ever could. Eileen watched the woman leave, holding the paper like something fragile and earned. She leaned back in her chair then, exhaled slowly, and looked down at her own hands that had once forgotten how to make beauty without pain. Now moving with a peace that came not from healing, but from choosing to stay open. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes catching the window light. She smiled faintly, then bent over her work once more, the thread drawing steady lines across fabric that would soon become someone else's story. Because in the end, it had never been about owning the boutique or reclaiming a title. It had never been about legacy carved in glass or stitched into labels. It had always been about something smaller and harder to hold, the quiet dignity of creating something beautiful, and the deeper power of giving others a place to do the same.